What are the attributes of a scholar?
He's smart.
Educated. Well
What
educated.
did I hear back there?
Wise.
Wise. Two very different things. Hopefully a scholar is going to be wise as well. What else?
Responsible.
Responsible. What else? Yeah.
I would say a warrior probably would also have to be wise, smart, and responsible.
We're going to get there. Yeah. And you're ahead of it.
Wise in two different things.
What's that?
They're gonna be wise in two different things.
How do you mean?
Would be wise, for example, like scholars, they're gonna be wise in whatever, like for example, like life, they'll be wise in that. And then warriors.
What do you mean by life? Are we all pretty good at life so far?
I mean,
It's working out pretty well for me. I can breathe.
Like the way they live, I guess you could say.
How?
Because like warriors, they always just go into the battle, right?
I don't know.
And
If we separate them, they do, yeah.
experience.
so then, like for warriors, like I guess you could say like how they fight. Or never, I don't really know.
No, but this is my point, though, is that we kind of are intuitively doing this. Thucydides is writing a very long time ago, and he's warning us against doing what we're doing right now almost intuitively. It's like if I ask you, do you want to, should you be a student or an athlete? You were talking about last time. We have this idea that like you're either good in school or you're good in sports.
Can't be both.
Yeah, I mean, when you look at the top universities for sports, think about
It looks open.
Think about it, when you look at the top universities for sports, the people who go there, you have to have good grades to go to those schools largely. This whole idea of like the athlete who can get into a sports school with like a 1.7 because they're great at a sport, that doesn't happen in real life. We think it does because we see that kind of a stereotype and that motif in television and in movies. But for example, when I was at UCLA, we'd play games, you'd be on television. And when you're on television, they actually put your GPA on there.
Really?
As part of your stats, yeah. So you have like, this whole infield right now has a combined GPA of, an average GPA of 3.8 or something like that. In other words, they would talk about that stuff. And our coach is this old guy. He's the winningest coach in college history. He used to, he'd say a lot with just a few words, and he would just kind of like walk around with his hands in his pockets and he'd say, I don't want a bunch of idiots on television. Get your grades, because he didn't want to get on television and say like, this whole infield has a average GPA of 2.1 and they're communications majors. You wouldn't want that. It makes everybody look bad. They do publish that data. Now if you're going to argue and say, well, there's schools that will inflate grades of athletes so that they can get in, then fine, we can have that discussion. But you don't get into these universities with like a 2.0 or a 2.1 just because you can play a sport. There's certain guys like, I don't know if you guys remember who Dennis Rodman, if you've heard the name, if you've seen the guy.
Yeah.
Yeah. That dude blows me away. Was he a Rhodes Scholar, if I'm not mistaken? In a incredibly high, you sit there like, geez Louise. You can talk about like Kaepernick, the taking a knee guy. He went to Stanford, didn't he? You don't get into Stanford just because you can throw a football. You get into Stanford if you can throw a football and be an athlete. And so the question becomes, which one would you rather be, an athlete or a scholar? And those universities have the luxury of saying yes. Yes. It's just like when you talk about the military, we think about military as being warriors. So what are the kind of attributes that we think of as the military as warriors having? Yeah.
Risk takers.
So maybe they're risk takers.
Brave.
What's that?
I think
Forbearance.
Richer. Just kidding.
Right here.
brave.
Brave.
Don't they have to have the ability to think rationally?
You tell me, dude. You're wearing the uniform. Think rationally.
Oh yeah.
By rationally, what do you mean?
Oh like.
I'll help you out. Because I am both. Warrior guns are practically. They're practical thinkers. By practical, you can tell me what practical means.
Like convenient.
They know the basics.
Convenient.
Yeah.
Kind of. It's what works.
Yeah.
It's what works. So for example, it was explained to me once by a friend of mine who's a professor of physics that you can work out an equation in physics that can show that a properly rooted dandelion can sustain the weight of an elephant, of a juvenile elephant dangling over a cliff. So according to formulas, you can make that work. Is it ever going to work in real life though?
No.
No, that's not practical. So you look at what's theoretical, then you look at what's practical. And so when they think rationally, they want to look at what works, what's going to happen in real life. Now, it becomes and as Sergio pointed out here, there's a problem here. Shouldn't these things all be interchangeable?
Yes.
If you're a scholar, shouldn't you be a risk taker? Because how can you possibly start to develop ideas unless you're taking the risk? I mean, it sounds kind of silly, but reading a book is a risk because it takes a long time to do that. To sit there, I think I told you guys this story. In one of my classes, I remember there are 3 books I carried with me at all times when I was an undergraduate. One of them is called The Contos by Ezra Pound. I actually have it on my shelf over there. And I remember I was sitting in the hallway one time reading this book. Outside of my professor, waiting for office hours. My professor came out and he goes, "Hey, Scanlon, what are you reading?" So I showed him. I said, "The Contos by Ezra Pound." He's all, "Why?" I go, "I want to know what it means." The book is it's all over the place, man. It's written in like 17 different languages. The guy was just incredibly smart, incredibly erudite, and he wrote in such a way that it's very difficult to understand. But I just figured a guy poured his life into this, and he's a well-known poet, so there must be something there. So I said, I want to know. And he just shook his head and he said, "Scal, there's nothing there." I go, "Whatever, what do you know?" So he went to his office, I followed him in. Finally, I got to the end of the book. It took years. I had to ask people to help me translate stuff, because again, there's a bunch of different languages and stuff in there.
17, right?
At the end of all of it, guess what I discovered? Nothing. Ezra Pound was fantastic. If you were a poet, and you had a poem that you wanted someone to help you develop and edit, and you gave it to Ezra Pound, he was fantastic at that. But the guy was so damn smart, he wasn't practical. In other words, I mean, you learn so much. What's the point of learning it all unless you can show it all off? And so he would show it all off, but who else can appreciate it except for yourself?
Yeah.
You know? In other words, it's not practical. He wasn't a practical scholar. And so I got to the end of this whole book, and I guess I learned forbearance, I guess I learned perseverance, I learned some things as I went, and I did get some things out of it, but certainly it wasn't worth the time investment. I could have gotten way more out of reading other things. But I can come to it. If any of you guys go into college in a couple of years and you do become a literature major, and you look at that book and you're like, I want to read this. Hopefully you'll think back and go, no, Scanlon invested the years already. I don't need to do this.
He walked so we could fly.
Yeah, exactly. And that is one of the values of going to school. We talk about why bother going to college. Well, that is one of the reasons for it, because you can be tutored by experts who can point you in the direction of the good stuff, so that you can not waste a whole bunch of time. Now, yes, it's the good stuff according to them. It's their opinion of the good stuff, but that's the risk you also take. Professor Berwick told me there's nothing there at the end of the Contos. I took a risk, didn't work out. But there's other stuff I have taken risks on, and it did work out fantastically. You have to be brave if you're going to be a scholar, because what's the point of having an idea that you're not willing to stand up for? If you're going to take a risk, invest your life, which means to invest your time, into developing an idea and holding the idea, you have to be brave to be able to present the idea. But if you've got something you believe in, you damn well better be ready to fight for it as well. If you have a family that you love and want to protect, well then you better learn how to protect it, and not depend on other people to protect it. Don't depend on other people to do your thinking for you, because you're just going to be their slave. And don't depend on other people to do your fighting for you either, because again, you're just going to end up being their slave.
Yeah.
You have to be able to do both. Thucydides is warning us against not doing this. He's saying a state, a country that does this, it separates warriors and scholars. In other words, they do it intentionally. And we're running this risk that we're going to have our thinking done by cowards. People who maybe have ideas, but are too cowardly to actually see them through. What's the point? Again, you may have like a deep idea, you may have a great idea, but you're a coward. You can't stand up for it. Imagine if Martin Luther King Jr. had this great idea, And he was just like, oh, but man, I might get shot, never mind. And he shies away from it. We never get to hear the idea.
No.
History is full of great ideas that we never got to hear because they were thought up by people who were not willing to risk themselves, not willing to risk their lives. And this is something that right now we have a lot of. People are so damn afraid of being called names and stuff like that. People are so afraid of getting called out and having people who they've never met before dogpile on them. You know, and so what do? Well, we don't present the ideas that we have. In fact, what actually ends up happening is that we reshape our ideas so that we can get along with everybody else around us because we're afraid to stand up for things. Or, on the other side of the coin, you've got people who just go out there and troll and pick fights online, and they just love the idea they can piss people off. Yeah, I guess you're picking fights with people, but you're not really thinking, you're not really presenting ideas. In fact, you're doing quite the opposite. You're finding out, well, what do you believe in? And then you find out, how can I piss this person off? You're not telling me what you really, I mean, you're revealing something that you think about humanity, but you're not telling me anything that you think actually scholastically, academically, intellectually. You don't want to be such a risk taker as a thinker that you come up with some really bad ideas, which happens a lot.
Yeah.
This happens a lot. We used to say that an idea could be so stupid, only someone with a PhD could think of it. Because when you get to a certain level of thinking, you don't, for example, when you're getting a PhD, you don't get credit for repeating something that somebody else said. You can't come along as a PhD in philosophy and say, you know what, Immanuel Kant, he had it right. You can't come along as a historian and say, you know what, I'm going to do my dissertation on Thucydides and just tell you he was right. You can't do that. You have to come along and give a completely different perspective. Well, what if the perspectives before you were correct? What if Kant was right? What if Thucydides was right? You don't get credit for that. You have to come along and tell me something new and something different. But if there are no other new or different ideas, you've just got to make stuff up. And this is what we end up with a lot right now. You see this.
So that's
You might not see it here. Well, if you have a greater perspective, I think we could see it, but I'll leave it at that. You can see it, yes.
also that's what you're trying to teach us, because that actually gives me
I'm
like
trying, man.
yeah, like well because like that's what you've been trying to tell us this entire time, and I'm just like, oh, so that's what you want us to do. It's like you don't want us to repeat what other like people from the past say and hear like people say and just pull plagiarism, or you don't want to. Either that, or you just want us to write bullshit and say and like say we know what we're talking about, but we really don't know what we're talking about. You really want us to give us a counter perspective and idea.
Isn't there enough bullshit in the world? Don't we complain about this? Don't
Yeah,
we complain about
politics.
how people lack authenticity?
Yeah.
And yet all over here,
Politics.
students who will brag about being in a class, and I'm sure you do it in other classes, talking about this one. Oh, I just bullshitted on that. Why on earth would you brag about that? Is that really something to be proud of, your ability to lie to people and bullshit people?
No.
Not your idea to come up with it almost seems like that would be, I mean, I don't know, I feel like if I bullshit on something, I feel like, not even I feel like, I know, I would be embarrassed. It'd be more like, I had to bullshit on that, man. I wasn't prepared for that. I wasn't ready for that. I had to bullshit on just to get by. You know, it wouldn't be a point of pride. It'd be a point of embarrassment and humiliation. And I guess I'd ask us to consider that. Why is it that we're not humiliated about having to be bullshit artists? You know, why are we so proud of that? And again, I'm not saying everybody, I'm not pointing any fingers. I could. But I'm not, you can point a finger at yourself if that's you. But it's funny, this is the kind of stuff that people get pissed about, people complain about. See, I'm talking shit. No, am I? Or am I telling you the truth? And other people aren't willing to tell you. And we all know that this is true. And I guess the question becomes, which one would you rather be? In fact, screw that. If you had children, which would you rather your child be? A bullshit artist, or would you rather your child be someone who knows and can speak powerfully, articulately, knowledgeably, intelligently, wisely? Or would you be so proud, my child just bullshitted their way through that. I'm so proud of them.
Oh my God, he's lying in his life.
It's going to be very difficult for you to be a role model to people that you raise. If you're gonna ask something very different of them than what you are, you know, every woman becomes like her mother. That's her tragedy in life, and no man becomes like his mother. And that's his tragedy in life. We tend to not. We tend to not to. I'll just leave it. I think some of you get to a point in your life, and this is one of the very difficult parts of growing up, when you finally like wake up one day and you look at your parents and go, "You're not who you've asked me to be." Maybe not even who they've presented themselves to be. Maybe they've never presented themselves to be anything at all. One thing, none of you can accuse me of hypocrisy. I told you in the first week of school, I am not a role model.
You're
I
not.
told you from the very beginning, and I've told you from the very beginning, I don't want you to be like me. I don't want you to do anything. All I want you to be able to do is to be able to think, develop ideas, and be able to defend the ideas. That doesn't mean you have to get out there and start fighting with everybody. It just means that you are able to defend your ideas. It just doesn't mean you go out there and you can kick everyone's asses. And that's not the point. The point is that if you're afraid, you can't present ideas. And the more things in life that you have to be afraid of, the fewer ideas you can present. If you're afraid of social pressure, that's going to limit the things that you can say. If you're afraid of getting punched in the face, that's going to limit the things that you can say. If you present yourself as incredibly powerful, then same thing, the other direction. No one can say anything to you, because they're afraid that you're going to punch them in the face. And then that means, therefore, you can never learn. And you don't even have an incentive to, because if anybody disagrees with you, you can just shut them up by using power. Might doesn't equal right, power doesn't equal truth. Questions? Yes.
What I just got from that, the state could be your mind.
Okay. How do you mean?
So the state that separates your mind is like you're letting your mind separate either you be a scholar or you be the warrior. But I feel like if you have like a strong mind, you should be able to do both, right? So just take away the separation and just like you don't have to be like a full smart ass, a full risk taker, like everything. But you can have one or another, right? So you can be responsible but also think rationally. Just to like take that separation away from it.
And I would suggest the thing that separates these two things, whether it's within your mind or whether it's from the state, is this thing, spirit. And I don't mean this in the sense that, like, oftentimes we'll use this as a way of trying to shame people, to put them down. Oh, I understand there's fear in you. It's not a patronizing thing. I really mean this. Like, we don't, like maybe we're great athletes or we're great warriors, but we're afraid of looking stupid by trying to develop ideas. Or maybe we have good ideas, but we're afraid of getting into physical confrontations. We're not, I mean, yeah, I didn't just say that. Or even just, or social pressure, which kind of can start to amount to the same thing. This is the thing that divides it. And whether it's your mind, which divides these things out, or whether it's the literal state. I mean, I would ask you that question, do you think that the state really wants you to be both of these two things? You know? I mean, what happens if warriors, if labor gets too scholarly? What happens if scholars get too, can laborious?
They become one another.
Oh, like I was thinking, like, I wonder how many of you can fix cars. And I wonder how many people are academics, but they can't fix cars. Or they can fix cars, but they can't really, engineer them. In other words, there are people out there. They're unicorns. Unfortunately, they're pretty rare, but they're both of these two things. They're practical. They can fix things. They can read books. They can read poetry. They can fight. And it doesn't mean that doesn't mean you can beat the crap out of everybody. It just means that you're willing to do that thing, to stand up for something. In other words, they're multifaceted. So often we try to push people in one direction or the other. Or, I think that's the deeper point, by the way, we push ourselves into one or the other. We're so caught up on this thing of like, yeah, society does that. Fuck society. We do it to ourselves. We do it to ourselves. I mean, how often are you presented with the opportunity to develop deep ideas and to create and to really think some important things through? And what do we choose instead? Yeah.
Don't you think that everyone can do that too? It just comes down to if they're willing to do it.
Yeah.
Like learn.
Yeah. Probably. I mean, what would stop you? I mean, even if you're not particularly scholarly, what you can be is as scholarly as you can be. Even if you're not particularly strong as a warrior, you can still be a pretty strong warrior. I mean, sorry. You can be as strong as you can be as a warrior. This doesn't have to be in relation to anybody else. This doesn't mean that you have to be the UFC champion. This doesn't mean you have to be a PhD from Harvard. This means as scholarly as you can be, and you're as strong of a warrior as you can be. And so much of this right here is just the willingness. It's the willingness to fight. What you're going to find is that people, especially people who will try to like, come against you and shout you down and put you down, they're cowards. That's why they do what they do. That's why there are people who will try to stop you from talking. I mean, haven't you've seen this, I'm sure, that you're making a point somewhere, or maybe you've seen someone else who's making a point somewhere, and some people will interrupt them and pick apart like one little thing about them. Well, you used the wrong form of something there. You used the wrong name. You know what, hang on, the way you said that tone is very offensive. It's got nothing to do with what you're saying. That's them trying to shut you down because they're afraid that what you're going to say has a point. They're not strong enough to stand up against your point. So they have to pick apart the way that you're saying it, or the little nuances in there that they just simply don't agree with to try to kind of spin you off in a different direction so you never actually get to your point. They're cowards. They're afraid of what you're going to say. They know that there's power in what you're going to say, probably, because what you're saying is probably practical. It's useful to people. You know?
Yeah, and this mindset actually, like fear is like a really big thing between scholars and warriors to me, because like it actually leads up to the idea where people think like this common mindset's like if it's about right or wrong, is it right for me to say this, or is it wrong for me to say this, or it could lead up to a reaction. Basically, that's like the common thing we get from this commonly every single time with scholars or warriors most of the time. Like, you really want to say your opinion, but you know, like, you think it's right, but it could be wrong. That's what people keep thinking about.
How often do I hear students say things like, well, you're not allowed to say this today. Fill in the blank, whatever this is.
What's the reason?
Why aren't you allowed to say it? Well, you know, people are... Got it. You don't have the warriorship to stand up against people. Well, it's because this can happen. Fine. But at least acknowledge what it is. Yeah, I'm afraid of this happening to me. That's totally fine. Totally understandable. Because there are things that you can challenge in life that can ruin your life. You can be so far on this side over here that you can ruin your life. Similarly, you can be so far on this side that you can ruin your life. In other words, if you never stand for anything, you're going to reach a point in your life where you're going to look back on your life and ask yourself if you ever stood for anything. You know? Hell, your children are going to ask you questions at some point. Well, if you're a bullshit artist now, man, you better be a great one when you have kids, because kids are fantastic at sniffing it out. And kids are also fantastic at being totally unforgiving when they find out that you're not what you presented yourself to be.